who knew that speechwriters were paid so much money? News yesterday leaked that Bill Shorten has a speechwriter, is expected to be paid $620,000 over a 2-year period. Her name is Julianne Stewart. She must be very good, and I don't blame her for taking the salary. She's already been paid $440,000 under this contract, which is set to end in September. Yet, according to Liberal Senator Maria Kovic, senators are only earning themselves $230,000 a year. Joining me to discuss this and more, Sky News contributor Chris Uhlmann. Chris, great to see you. Was this advertised, this job? And if so, why didn't you and I apply?
I was going to say the same thing. We're clearly in the wrong gig, Steve, because that sort of money you'd kill for that, wouldn't you? So $620,000 over 2 years, and one assumes that's probably not her only contract, that she might have more on the go. So good luck to her, as you say, being paid for by the department. But some of the other things that the Department of Services Australia said are even more disturbing. They said that there are 200 people in their media section at the moment, and they had market failure. They couldn't find one of them, and some of them paid upwards of $140,000 a year, capable of writing speeches for the minister. And can I say that's of a part with things that I've heard around this town for a long time, that the standard in the bureaucracy of English is so poor as to be completely risible, that some of it's completely unserviceable. So there are lots of things to be disturbed about in this story, Steve, and possibly least of all of them is that we're not getting that money.
You and I can go back a long way, and we remember there has been some extraordinary speechwriters who've worked in Parliament, mostly for Prime Ministers. I mean, I was unaware that these departments have such big media sections now. I mean, the public service is certainly, is it not an area where if you're an incoming government, you want to crack down on spending, that's one of the places you might start?
Oh, Steve, I think it's completely out of control, and particularly the communications parts of these departments now, where there are hundreds of people, and the Department of Defence, for example, is another one. But you try asking a question and getting an answer out of the Department of Defence, you'll find it very difficult. In the olden days, you used to know the name of the person who held that job. Well, nowadays, it's media@pickyourdepartment.gov.au, and you send it off into the void and hope that you might get a response. And I think they make being anonymous actually part of their jobs now, so they don't actually have to answer questions. So across the entire bureaucracy, and not only that, the level of payments that we pay out to our bureaucrats compared to what they get around the rest of the world. You know, I used to make a habit of looking at what was, and this is, you know, it's a government business, but the Australia Post payments there for a year went up to about $6 million. The managing director of Australia Post, they would argue that they needed to basically be competitive. Well, the competitor in the United States at the time was getting around about $320,000 US. So I think that there's an issue here with the amount of money that the bureaucracy gets paid, and it's a public service. They should be able to get those services for a lot less than they're getting them now.
Chris, speaking about spending, NDIS, we spoke about it at the beginning of the program. I think in the budget now it's something like $45 billion a year. It's the second biggest spend the federal government has. It was born out of that infamous Kevin Rudd sit down on the floor with butcher paper meeting, and it had the right spirit about it. And none of us want to criticise proper spending on people with disabilities, but the rorting that's going on in this thing now is completely out of control, where you've got, you know, clients going down with their case managers to ATMs to withdraw cash to buy drugs. I mean, that's just a complete scandal, Chris. I mean, poor old Bill Shorten's got to try and sort it out, but he's had 2 years and the incompetence continues.
Look, and the figures are staggering. Like, so last night it was said it's 5% of the total spend, $2.5 billion probably, which is being completely misallocated, and it's going to criminals in some circumstance. And you said it earlier, anytime you pile up a great big stash of government money, the criminals will come looking for it. And unfortunately, in this circumstance too, it has the added horror of the fact that it will be people who are disabled who are being exploited by them. But there's a real boundary issue with this, and that goes back to its formulation. You talk about the butcher's paper, but one of the organisations I hold responsible for this too is the Productivity Commission, and in its good iterations in the olden days when it was supposed to run a ruler over these things. Its report on what would happen with the NDIS would be such a boon for society that we would actually end up making money out of it. And I remember at the time thinking that was highly unlikely, and what we saw was at the outset the boundaries of the system were never properly defined, and people with very mild problems indeed were allowed into this system, and that's what's blown it out. Now, once you've given people something, Steve, it's very hard to take it off them. So winding this thing back will be an extraordinary job for anyone.
With all your experience in observing Canberra, have you ever seen a minister hang on as grimly as Andrew Giles, and why do you think he's being protected?
Well, the night is short. The list is long of all of those who've caused trouble for their governments in the past, and certainly Andrew Giles is causing trouble for his Prime Minister at the moment, and the Prime Minister would be holding on to him for the same reason that every other Prime Minister before him has. They do not want to give, he does not want to give the Liberal Party, the opposition, any kind of win on this at the moment. But if the bleeding gets bad enough, then eventually the Prime Minister will act. But you know, you don't have to be an incompetent minister to do damage to the government. One of the ones I thought that did most damage to his government rolls back to 2007, when Chris Evans, who was then leader of the opposition in the Senate, and he was responsible for immigration at the time, he unwound the Howard government's Pacific solution and said it was one of the best days of his life, one of the best things he'd ever done in public policy. Well, look at the outcome from that, Steve. And I don't think that Chris Evans was in any way incompetent, but that's one of the biggest public policy disasters that faced the Rudd government. Of course, ended up unseating it.
Never a dull day in Canberra, Chris. It was a pleasure to catch up with you, my friend. Thanks a lot. Chris Uhlmann there.